I want to tell you about the Tuesday I forgot my badge, because if I hadn't turned my car around on Burnside Street, I might be filing a joint tax return right now instead of a police report. For weeks before my wedding, I stood outside my own kitchen window, listening to the man I loved describe, in the same easy voice he used to order coffee, exactly how he planned to walk away with everything I'd built. He didn't know I was standing there. He didn't know what I actually did for a living. And he had no idea that the woman he was about to marry had spent 9 years being paid specifically to catch people who talk exactly like that. My name is Maren Whitfield. I'm 33, and I'm a senior fraud investigator for a regional insurance carrier in Portland, Oregon. Most people think that means I deny umbrella claims. What it actually means is that I read financial documents the way other people read their horoscopes, looking for the one detail that doesn't match the story wrapped around it. I've caught contractors who torched their own restaurants. I've caught a dentist who staged a break-in at his own office 2 weeks before bankruptcy. I've learned that the best liars never look desperate. They look relaxed. They look exactly like Preston Hale. Preston was 39, a wealth consultant, with a corner office in the Pearl District and a laugh that made my mother's book club ask, unprompted, if he had a brother. He remembered my co-workers' kids' names. He sent flowers to my office on the anniversary of my father's death without being asked. When I brought him around my friends, at least 3 of them pulled me aside and said some version of the same sentence. You don't let this one go, Maren. I never told him exactly what my job involved. Not a lie, a habit. Case files are confidential, so I'd trained myself to say insurance stuff and let the sentence die there. He knew I worked odd hours and sometimes drove 2 hours to a site visit without explaining why. He believed, because I let him, that I mostly did paperwork. I told myself I was protecting my cases. It would take me a long time to admit I might also have been protecting something else. 14 months into our relationship, everything had the settled quality good things have when they're not hiding anything. Or so I thought. We'd booked the venue, a barn outside Hood River with string lights, and a $4,200 deposit. My sister had already cried over centerpiece photos. Preston handled almost all the wedding logistics himself, which I found touching at the time. He said he wanted me to relax. He said he liked taking care of things. That Tuesday started like any other. I left the house at 7:40, dry cleaning in the back seat, headed to a 9 a.m. site visit 40 minutes out. I was 3 blocks down Burnside when I patted my bag for my company badge and realized it wasn't there. I'd left it on the counter, in the exact spot I always leave it. I turned around without thinking twice. I let myself in through the side door, because it was closer to the driveway. And that's when I heard Preston's voice through the kitchen window, on the phone, pacing, a tone I'd never once heard him use with me. Flat, efficient, rehearsed. Once the marriage certificate's filed, the rest just falls into place on the timeline we talked about. I want to tell you my body reacted with panic. It didn't. It went cold and still. The exact stillness I get at my desk when a number on page 4 doesn't match the story on page 1. I stepped back against the siding, out of his sight line, and I listened. He kept going, low and unhurried, laying out a plan he'd clearly said before. After the wedding, he'd bring up simplifying things, combining our accounts, adding himself to the deed on my condo, a document his associate could draw up, just for peace of mind. He made it sound like tenderness. I've read that exact document 100 times under 100 different names, and none of them were tenderness. Then he laughed, quiet and pleased with himself, and said I had no idea how much I was actually worth on paper, and even less idea how to protect it. My chest went tight. I stood in my own driveway listening to the man I was about to marry describe my life like a claim he'd already approved. And then, before I'd consciously decided anything, my thumb was already on my phone, voice memo running, catching every word through the screen door. I didn't confront him that day. I want to be honest about that. I walked back to my car the same way I'd come, quiet, unhurried, my face doing absolutely nothing. Something inside me had already rearranged itself. But 9 years of interviewing liars had taught me one rule above all others. The moment you tip your hand, the evidence disappears with the person holding it. If you've ever sat across from someone you loved and felt the ground shift under a sentence they didn't know you heard, I want you to know you're not imagining it. Stay with me. I drove to the site visit. I don't remember a single thing about it. Around noon I sat in my car in a Fred Meyer parking lot and listened to the recording 3 times. By the third time, I wasn't hearing my fiancé anymore. I was hearing a subject. That word did something useful. It gave me somewhere to stand. What unsettled me most wasn't the plan. It was the rhythm of it. Amateurs sound nervous. Preston sounded bored, like a man reading a script he'd worn smooth. I called Denny that afternoon. He'd trained me my first year at the company and now ran background verification for a title insurance firm. Legitimate, public records work. Nothing that would raise a flag. I gave him Preston's full name and the town in Idaho where he grew up, and asked him to run what he legally could. He called back 2 days later, and I remember exactly where I was standing. My kitchen, back against the counter, because I never once sat down for that call. Preston had been engaged twice before me. Both times, within 8 months of the wedding date, the engagement dissolved. One broken off outright. One that made it to the courthouse and unraveled in an annulment 11 months later. In both cases, according to county property records Denny could pull, joint accounts had been opened and a name added to a deed shortly before the split. Both women walked away with a fraction of what they'd brought in. Neither had filed a complaint. People who've been humiliated, Denny said, usually don't want witnesses to the humiliation. They sign, they disappear, and they call it a lesson instead of what it was. I sat with that for 2 nights. I thought about how gently Preston always talked about his past, the woman who'd used him for stability, the one who'd gotten cold feet. I'd believed every word. I'd even resented women I'd never met on his behalf. By the second sleepless night, next to a man who had no idea what I now knew, I understood this wasn't one lie. It was a method. I started watching him the way I watch a claim file. Not as his fiancé, but as an investigator watching a subject. The way every wedding budget conversation drifted toward my accounts. The way combining finances for simplicity came up twice a week now, always wrapped in warmth. The way he'd mention updating my beneficiary designation, since we're basically married already. As if urgency were a form of love. I thought about calling it off that week. I had his contact open on my phone more than once. What stopped me wasn't sentiment. It was the 2 women before me, who'd signed and vanished and never said a word. If I walked away quietly, Preston would simply recalibrate and find someone new in another zip code. He'd done it twice already. I decided I wasn't going to be the file he closed without consequences. So instead of confronting him, I did what 9 years of training had actually prepared me for. I decided to build the case. For the next several weeks, I became something I'd never had to be, an actress inside my own engagement. I laughed at dinner. I let him hold my hand across the table at Le Pigeon while he talked about honeymoon flights to Kauai. Every night I came home and performed devotion. And every night after he fell asleep, I lay awake cataloging the day's evidence like it was a claim file with a deadline. Preston, meanwhile, grew bolder, which told me everything about how sure he'd become. He wanted to add himself to my condo deed, just a formality for married couples. He wanted to change my life insurance beneficiary before the wedding, so we're not scrambling after. And then, almost as an afterthought over wine, he mentioned that his associate, a man named Gary Sook, could draft a durable power of attorney in case anything ever happens to either of us. I agreed to all of it out loud. I told him it sounded reasonable. I watched something settle in his face every time I said yes. Not joy, exactly. Satisfaction. The look of a man watching a timeline hold. Behind the scenes, I found an estate attorney 40 minutes away with zero connection to our circle, a woman named Odalise Ferrer. I told her everything. The recording, Denny's findings, the paperwork Preston kept sliding across the table. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I still think about. Nothing in the documents was unusual on its own. Couples merge accounts, update beneficiaries. What made it different was the sequencing, and the fact that every single page benefited one person substantially more than the other. She laid it out plainly. The power of attorney alone would let Preston manage, transfer, or liquidate nearly everything I owned without my signature on individual transactions. Combined with the deed and the beneficiary change, I would be handing him, in practice, control of 9 years of savings and a condo I'd paid for entirely on my own. That was around the time I learned something that turned my stomach in a way the rest hadn't managed to. Gary Sook, the associate drafting the paperwork, wasn't licensed to give financial advice at all. No registration, no oversight, just a business card and good posture. And when Odalise's paralegal pulled a little further, she found Preston's mother, Diane, listed as a witness signature on documents connected to both of his previous engagements. She wasn't a mother offering support. She was, by every pattern I could see, part of the machine. If you've ever discovered that the person hurting you wasn't acting alone, that the warmth around them was doing quiet work of its own, I want you to know that recognizing the pattern is not paranoia. It's the first useful thing you'll do. Keep going. I hired a private investigator Odalise trusted, a retired financial crimes detective named Tobias Wren, and told Preston I needed 4 days in Spokane for my aunt's surgery. It was the first flat lie I'd ever told him, and how easily it came out unsettled me more than anything he'd done. Tobias worked fast. Within 2 days, he'd confirmed Preston was meeting twice weekly at a coffee shop on Alberta Street with a woman named Cass Odom, laptops and folders between them. My stomach dropped toward the obvious assumption before Tobias stopped me cold. She wasn't a girlfriend. She was a business partner. And the business, it turned out, was women exactly like me. Odom ran a small financial matchmaking service, and half her recent clients had married into debt they never saw coming. Deeper digging landed the piece that made the whole shape click. Preston wasn't opportunistic. He was underwater. Court filings showed he'd lost close to $610,000 in 2 failed short-term rental developments over 3 years. 2 private lenders had judgments against him he'd kept quiet through partial settlements. His wealth consultancy hadn't taken a new client in 8 months. Nearly all his recent income, Tobias suspected, had come from exactly this: engagements, timelines, and paperwork. Sitting in Odalise's office that third night, looking at a whiteboard timeline, 2 prior fiancés, a mother as recurring witness, an unlicensed associate, a business partner running due diligence on his next mark, $610,000 in debt that would vanish the moment he had access to what I owned. I finally asked her the only question that mattered. What would it take to make none of it matter, no matter what I eventually signed? She said it could be done. It would take precision and time. I told her I had both. I came home from Spokane and let Preston fuss over me, made tea, told me I looked tired. I let him. I needed to know exactly what I was up against, and he was, I'll admit, very good at this. Not good as in kind, good as in skilled. We didn't cancel anything. Invitations were already out, and Odalise was clear. Calling it off early would just give him time to disappear and start over somewhere else. I needed him to walk all the way to the altar believing he'd won. 2 weeks before the ceremony, he brought home the finished folder: power of attorney, deed transfer, updated beneficiary form, and slid it across the table like a gift. I read it slowly, asked one question about wording to seem thoughtful rather than suspicious, and signed every page. What he didn't know was that Odalise and I had spent the previous 10 days moving nearly everything real: my savings, my investment accounts, and eventually the condo equity itself, into an irrevocable trust with its own trustee and its own protections. The documents he was so proud of applied, by the time I signed them, to a fraction of what he thought was there. He kissed my forehead and thanked me for making it easy. Some tired part of me still ached even then. I'd loved a version of him for 14 months. Grieving that version while dismantling the real one turned out to be its own kind of work. The morning of the wedding, my mother fastened the last button on my dress, already crying for reasons that had nothing to do with what I knew. Odalise sat near the back in a pale blue dress, unremarkable, carrying a folder that looked identical to Gary Sook's, except everything in hers was real. I walked down the aisle exactly as rehearsed. When the officiant reached the part where he asks if anyone has reason the 2 of us shouldn't marry, I asked if I could say a few words first. Preston's face flickered, confusion, then indulgence, like he assumed I wanted a moment for us. I told the room that 4 weeks earlier, I'd gone home for a forgotten badge and heard something that changed everything I understood about the man beside me. Then I played the recording. His own voice filled the room, describing the plan, the timeline, how it'll already be too late if I ever figured it out. I watched 200 people go from confused to silent in about 10 seconds. Odalise walked to the front and, without theatrics, laid it out. The $610,000 in concealed debt, the unlicensed associate, the pattern across 2 prior engagements, and the fact that every document he believed had just worked applied to assets that no longer existed on paper. Preston's mother stood up from the front pew, gathered her purse, and left through the side door without a word to her son. Guests didn't gasp or shout. They stood, one row at a time, and filed out in the particular silence of people who'd just watched something true happen in a room built for promises. My father's hand stayed steady on my shoulder the whole time. The fallout moved fast. Preston's advisory license was suspended within 5 weeks, then revoked. His firm let him go before the suspension went public. Gary Sook lost his own footing once regulators started asking who exactly he'd been advising and under what authority. Cass Odom's matchmaking service quietly shut its website down. What surprised me wasn't Preston's unraveling. I'd already grieved that in advance. It was what happened when Odalise's office reached out, with my blessing, to the 2 women from his past. I expected silence. Instead, once they understood they weren't alone, both came forward through their own attorneys. Neither had ever filed a report. With 3 documented patterns instead of 1, that finally changed. I went back to work the following Monday. No parade, no announcement, just my desk, my inbox, a stack of claims waiting for someone to notice what didn't add up. A few coworkers who knew pieces of it gave me a hand on the shoulder, and nothing more. That's the kind of kindness that actually helps. I don't feel triumphant when I think about it now. I feel something steadier. Gratitude that I forgot a badge on an ordinary Tuesday. Gratitude for 9 years of training that taught me to gather evidence before I trust a feeling. I think often about the 2 women who came before me, and I understand now, in a way I couldn't before this happened to me, exactly how someone ends up there. It isn't weakness. It's love offered honestly to someone who rehearsed exactly how to spend it. If this reached you at the right moment, if some part of you is standing outside a window you don't want to look through yet, I hope you trust what you already heard. We spend our whole lives being warned about strangers. Nobody warns you about the version who remembers your coffee order and calls your mother on her birthday. I didn't learn that lesson in a training room. I learned it in my own driveway, because I turned my car around for a piece of plastic with my photo on it. If this story stayed with you, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and subscribe. There are more stories like this one still to tell.